So welcome everyone to the sixth and final segment of my six-part 2018 live stream video series. Today's topic is on overcoming fear in philanthropy, which I'm quite excited about. So why don't we jump right in. Today what I want to do is share with you three things around overcoming fear. First is 11 ways that fear manifests itself in the way we work in philanthropy and as grant makers. Second is 6 reasons why this is a problem, why fear holds us back from having the kind of impact that we want to have. And then thirdly, what to do about it. So I hope you end today having identified many of your fears and very clear solutions for overcoming them. So what do we mean by fear? A fear is defined, according to the dictionary, as an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous or likely to cause pain or a threat. And what I find really interesting are synonyms for fear, because I think they help us to begin to see how much fear impacts us in our work. So let me just share some of these with you, which hopefully you can see here. I think there are a couple of them. They start with kind of the most serious, I would say. And I would suggest that terror and fright don't usually apply to our work as grant makers and giving away money or our work in philanthropy. Although it's certainly possible. Alarm, sometimes, if you're experiencing a community crisis or some kind of natural disaster or local disaster or something like that. And horror, I'm going to get to a little bit later, but I think it does impact us. We do experience horror, maybe not personally, but also in the work that we're doing with our grantees. But these synonyms, I think, are particularly interesting, right? I mean, think about your day-to-day work, what happened to you today, thus far, or last week, or last month. How often do we experience feelings of panic, agitation, trepidation, dread, dismay, anxiety, worry, angst, unease, or nervousness? And I didn't include them up here, but there were also a few informal synonyms like getting the heebie-jeebies or having the willies. But I think what's interesting is we do experience a lot of these often in little and small ways. And I think it helps us to begin to illuminate how fear really gets in our way. So I want to share with you 11 manifestations of fear. And if you have hopefully you've received your discussion guide for this broadcast, and they're actually listed there. As I go through these 11 manifestations of fear, I want you to just think about whether you experience these or you think that your organization experiences them, and just make a note, just a little hash mark every time you experience one of these. And then we're going to add them up at the end. So, and also I just want to say these are not listed in any, I'm going to say them, they're not listed up here, in any order of priority. Okay, so the first is a fear of failure. We fear failing. We fear screwing up. And we'll say things like, what if our new initiative on, fill in the blank, trauma-informed care, improving water quality, early childhood education, what if it fails, right? What if we conduct an evaluation and learn that we're not doing a good job? What if I give a speech and I freeze on stage and I can't remember what I'm supposed to be saying? What if I really don't have the ability to be a CEO of a foundation, and I'm always going to be stuck being a number 2? We really fear failure, and what happens as a result is we end up spending a lot of time and effort dancing around the issue in ways to essentially kind of elongate the process and the time by which we have to actually make a decision about moving forward, applying for the CEO role, agreeing to give a speech, whatever it might be. And so we engage in things like endless amounts of data and research to unpack and unearth every possible nuance of a potential new initiative that we're fearful of failing. Or we engage in endless amounts of coaching and leadership development trainings and whatnot for years on end before we have the courage to apply for that CEO role. The second manifestation of fear is a fear of taking risk. And this manifests itself a lot in things like being afraid to engage in policy advocacy, because what if we might break a law, rather than learning what's allowable to do for a private foundation or a public charity. Or it manifests itself in just being afraid to try new things, try new strategies and tools, partner with a different kind of organization like a university or a county government agency, because we're afraid of the risk involved. The third is fear of making decisions. I see this a lot in strategic planning. As you know, I am very frustrated by the 18-month strategic planning process. And what's even worse is by the time you finally get to your plan, you have a strategic plan at the end of that 18 months. Now you embark on a 12-month process to develop your implementation plan. So 3 years later, you finally are ready to implement your strategic plan. But most plans last for 3 years. So basically you're ready to start all over again, right? And what that 3 years is spent is not making decisions, or making them and then reconsidering them, or making them and then have another subgroup of board members approve them and finalize them and tweak them until we all can't take it anymore. In fact, I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal this morning, there was an article about like the 5 greatest mistakes that CEOs make in making decisions. And one of them is making a decision, broadcasting that decision to your employees and whatnot, and then waffling on it, and then changing your mind, and then going back and shifting around and causing a lot of confusion and fear for your employees. I was recently coaching a foundation CEO, and he needed to make a pretty major decision for the organization. And he was waffling. He had ample evidence that the situation needed to be corrected, but he was waffling and actually said, I have a hard time making decisions. I'm very indecisive. And what I said back to him was, for how long do you want this problem to continue? For how long do you need to continue to see this pattern that he had already seen for months? For how much more data do you need to collect in order to make this decision? And he said, you're right. I have ample evidence. I know the right course I need to take, and I just need to make this decision. The fourth is fear of alienating others or disappointing others. So this is fear of saying no. We do experience this a lot. Fear of saying no to grantees, fear of saying no to organizations that want us to serve on their board or attend their event or whatever it might be. I was advising one foundation leader who called me really to have me help her figure out how to get off a board of directors. It was causing her a lot of stress. She didn't like being on the board. She didn't think they were productive, making smart decisions, or listening to any of her advice. It was wasting her time, and she feared disappointing them because she had agreed to serve on the board, but she really wanted off. It was a waste of her time. Another example is, community foundations experience this fear of alienating or disappointing others a lot because, a challenge of community foundations is many people expect them to be all things to all people for all issues in the community. And when they seek to focus on a particular issue or address a particular cause, they worry that they're going to alienate others and in particular donors in the community. And that's a fear. Another way this manifests is a fear of sharing research. So many funders and donors will, as they're exploring, funding a new topic or issue, they might conduct research and needs assessment to identify, if we did want to support substance abuse treatment or mental health or whatever the issue might be, what would that look like? What do the data say? What are the best practices? They have all that information. Then they decide, for legitimate reasons, we're not going to pursue that program area. But then they fear sharing it. And so they hold that data to themselves because they don't want to disappoint the people that would have been funded otherwise, right? Instead of, we have all this research, we'll share it with the community. It's of value to people. A fifth is not taking the lead. So this is the funder that's not willing to take the lead on something, but is happy to participate if another corporate giving program or donor or foundation would take the lead. So they're not willing to take the lead in conducting the research and designing the new funding initiative for whatever it is, and kind of sticking their neck out, staking a claim that this is an important issue to focus on, trusting that the research is accurate and their interventions are legitimate and likely to result in the outcomes they seek, right? They're afraid that they don't want the visibility. What if they fail, right? It's all on them. They fear taking the lead. But if literally another funder down the street did the exact same thing and said, hey, come on board, if you can contribute, some money to this, it'll help us and you can partner with us, then they're likely to say, sure, I'll jump on board, because if it fails, it's not on me, right? It's on you. A sixth manifestation of fear in philanthropy is fear of recognition and visibility. So this we see commonly in anonymous donations, funders and donors that don't want it to be known who they are because they fear that people will know the kinds of issues and causes they support, and or they are afraid that people will come to them asking for money because they now know that you fund whatever it is, right? And a lot of, there's a trend now where a lot of people have, family foundations, and they create separate anonymous donor-advised funds so that they can allow themselves to give to certain kinds of causes anonymously. But it's really a fear of recognition and a fear of visibility. And interestingly, this is a cultural issue. So I would say in the US, for the most part, funders are pretty open and willing to talk about what they're doing, what they're funding, what they're learning. In other countries, it's very different. So I was asked recently to, in the Netherlands, there's a philanthropy news media outlet online, and they've asked me to be their, US expert advisor for their readers. And I learned in talking with them that in the Netherlands, there's a much greater fear of sharing what a foundation is doing or what a donor is doing, the grants they're giving and things like that, because it's really perceived as bragging. And philanthropy is really important. It's a big part of their culture, but it's the thing that you do because it's the right thing to do. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves. But again, it's part of that, I think, fear of what happens if people know about what I'm doing. The seventh is a fear of learning that you aren't right. And I thought about calling this a fear of being wrong, but I actually think the fear is in the discovery or the potential discovery that you're not right, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So this is things like not listening to people who have very different political views than we do, or cultural views or beliefs, which I think is really exacerbated now in the way that we receive news and social media, where there's these algorithms that sort of track what we want to know and just feed us this increasing narrow band of information, so we don't really see other people's opinions and learn from them. But I think this also manifests in many funders' refusal to really learn from the people who are most impacted by the issues we're trying to support, right? So this is the donor who declares he or she wants to support some new project or issue, but bases their decisions on talking to other ultra-high net worth donors and academic research and reports and things that are formed from national scans, and literally not willing to step foot in the neighborhood, in their community, where they're trying to help because they're fearful of that neighborhood and what might happen to them if they go there, and fearful of talking to the people that are most involved. And I think part of the fear is learning that their strategy might not really be accurate. So let's say you want to fund early childhood education, right, which is a legitimate need. I mean, that's a need in this country and probably around the world. And you have your kind of clean strategy formulated, how you're going to do this. Many funders fear really delving in and talking to the community and understanding, well, what's happening for you with early childhood education? Why don't you send your kids to quality programs? And you might learn things like, we want to, but we have no public transportation in our neighborhood, and I can't possibly get my kid to preschool and myself to my job on time, and I have to put food on food on the table for my family. That's my priority. I have to keep the job so my kid doesn't go to preschool. And as a funder, you don't really want to hear that because that's a lot more work for you. You now have a much more complex problem to solve, and it's much easier and cleaner when you can fund your straightforward early childhood education strategies. And let me just say another way that this manifests, because I think this is really important. The fear of learning that you're not right is unconscious bias. And especially for white donors and foundation leaders and corporate giving program leaders, people fear embracing and really engaging in diversity, equity, and inclusion in their philanthropy because they might learn they're not as non-racist as they thought they were. They might realize they have more biases than they thought they did. And they just don't want to learn that about themselves. And so there's a fear of engaging in that kind of work. Number 8 is a fear of loss. And I think a good example is what I just said. So you fear learning that you have more racial bias than you realized. And what you're also fearing is the loss of the person that you thought you were. And it can be scary. Another way people fear loss is fear loss of control. David Callahan from Inside Philanthropy argues, and I agree with him, that many funders don't want to fund core operating support, general operating support, which is money to help nonprofits, keep the lights on, and here we trust that you know what you're doing and you'll use this in the best way possible. Many funders feel that's a way of losing control, and they'd rather have control over the money by saying, here's your clear objectives and goals, and these are your deliverables, and we're going to track your progress and make sure that you met your objectives, right? That's a form of control. Loss of legacy is another fear. Another type of fear of loss, especially in family foundations, and I think also in companies that were started, kind of family businesses that have grown. I used to work at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and this was, many years ago, in the late 1990s, when it was probably the largest foundation in the country, maybe the world. And they had a video. You show up for new staff orientation, and one of the first things you do is sit down and watch this lovely video that they created about Dave Packard and his wife Lucille and their family, and how he helped to co-start Hewlett-Packard out of the garage, and why they started this family foundation and their goals and vision. And really it's all about preventing a loss of legacy. The funders realized, as this foundation grows and over time, and we're going to continue to have staff turnover, which is natural and normal, we need to make sure we have a way to maintain the legacy of the founders of this foundation. A ninth fear is a fear of abundance. So I've talked a lot, if you've been listening to some of the past live video webinars, I've talked a lot about having a poverty mentality versus an abundance mentality in philanthropy. And this is a fear of abundance, really a fear of investing in yourself as a donor, as a corporate giving program, as a foundation, because you feel guilt. You feel like we already have all this money, we don't need to help ourselves anymore. All the money should go into the community and help other people, right? And it's really this guilt associated with this fear. I don't deserve to spend money on an executive coach, or building our organizational capacity, or shifting from a paper-based to an online grants management system, or travel for my kids to attend conferences to learn about philanthropy, right? We can't invest in ourselves in order to grow. I was actually talking recently to a corporate funder about this need to invest in strategy development for their corporate giving program, and accompanied with that kind of some research into some key issues that they were interested in exploring. And he really didn't want to spend any money. He felt like, gosh, we can't spend money on ourselves. Again, it has to all go to the community. And what I said to him was, look around. You probably spend more money annually misting the plants in this company headquarters than you would on this initiative. So why don't you think you're at least worth as much as the plants are worth, right? You need to nourish yourself as much as they need to be nourished. And he understood that. Number 10 is fear of what's happening in the world and in our communities, right? So, the reality is we live in a crazy time. There are, of course, things happening around the world, and this gets back to my point earlier about horror, which is, there's mass shootings, there's violence, war, the way that immigrants and refugees are being treated around the world, racism, trauma, climate shifting, all kinds of things that, genuinely are horrifying when you think about what people are experiencing around the world. And as funders, we have glimpses into that in the ways that we're trying to help people, and it can generate a lot of fear. And I think this fear is really exacerbated in a lot of ways by some media outlets and, and social media, if nothing else, because we are really bombarded by information that's coming at us about what's happening hour by hour, minute by minute, right? It's our phones are beeping, we have notifications, these apps, we have our phones, and we're standing in line at the grocery store, we're checking and flipping and reading all this stuff in social media, whatnot. Honestly, I go to CNN.com and I literally experience fear for the moments before I go on the website, because I know they're going to have these ginormous headlines in all black, big font of the latest horrible thing that's happening in the world, and it's fear invoking. The last one number 11, is fear of repressive political and legal environment in philanthropy. So you heard me right. I said fear of repressive political and legal environments in philanthropy and around the world. So most of us in the US really don't experience this. We might be annoyed and frustrated and angry about certain legislation at a federal level or a state level, but usually we wouldn't describe it as repressive. But things are very different around the world, and in different countries there are much less degrees of political and civil space open for philanthropy to flourish and nonprofit organizations to flourish. So just an example, this summer, Open Society Foundations, which has offices around the world, they have an office in Budapest, Hungary, and they had to move 100 employees out of their Budapest office to Berlin, Germany, an entirely different country, for fear. And it was about 60% of their staff, because there was an increasingly repressive and hostile environment toward philanthropy in Budapest. I mean, who knew, right? So the president of the foundation said, "It has become impossible to protect the security of our operations and our staff from arbitrary government interference." And this was due to some new legislation in Hungary that was blocking any organization from advising asylum seekers without some kind of governmental license. And they actually said specifically that they intended to, were focusing on non-governmental organizations, and also that they specifically named Open Society Foundation, the government did, as one of these non-governmental organizations they were focusing on. So the foundation felt it was important to relocate staff and their families to another country in order to not experience this oppression. So you can imagine the fear. In fact, the Association of German Foundations, recognizing all these professionals and their families were coming, created like a welcoming program where they offered legal advice and services to help families relocate. I mean, can you imagine finding out that staff from Washington, D.C. Foundation had to relocate to Toronto, and the Canadian Association of Foundations, or whatever it might be called, has to welcome you? I mean, it's just crazy, right? But this is happening. I was speaking earlier this summer in Belgium with a woman who is leading a philanthropy association in Russia, and she talked about how in Russia, philanthropy is one of the only forms of free speech that they have. So it's just an indication of kind of what's happening around the world and some of the fears that people experience in philanthropy. So add up your list of how many of those fears you experience or your foundation experiences. And then if you have if you experience 1 to 2 of those fears, I would consider you to be a courageous funder. If you experience 3 to 6 of them, I would say you need to make some changes, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. And if you experience 7 to all 11 of those fears, then I would say you need professional help. And I mean that, to be funny and also literally. So, I mean, honestly, if you experience 10 or 11 of these, you really do need to get professional help immediately. Probably therapy for you and your entire team, because you must be so stressed out. But, there's lots of ways that you can get help to help you through some of these fears. And I think what's important to say, though, is you don't have to experience any of them. I mean, you can create a situation for yourself where you're just not experiencing these on a regular basis. Even if you have one, you can do something about that. So let me just pause for a moment and see if we have any questions. So someone asks, how do we know when fear is holding us back? So that's a really good question. I would say a couple things. I would say, quite literally, you have this list of 11 manifestations of fear. So maybe you can think of 2 more, I don't care, whatever it is, but maybe regularly take that list and keep it with you. Share it with your team, bring it up at a quarterly staff meeting, kind of look at it and ask yourself, am I experiencing any of these and why? And especially look for patterns. So, this would be a good example to share. So I was at this training a while ago, and I was reflecting on a fear that I had experienced professionally in my consulting career. And basically what had happened was when I was a kid, I don't know, like 9, 8, probably my age of my twins right now, there was this kind of trend at my school where we created clubs. And it was like a bunch of friends getting together and forming a club. So I thought that'd be a cool idea. And I invited 2 of my friends over to have a club, and they were all excited. They came over, I was all excited, and we all sat down and they stared at me. And I realized I had no game plan. Like, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know what the club was supposed to be about. I didn't know what we were gonna do. Like, I hadn't thought at all beyond like inviting them and sitting down together. And I was terrified and I was really embarrassed. And I just felt like kind of a fraud. Like, who am I to create this club, right? So whatever, 35 years pass or some number of time. And I noticed that I was walking into meetings with potential clients and having flashbacks to that feeling that I had as a kid of like, oh my God, I don't have a plan. And so I'm walking into meetings and the feeling I should be having is what? Confidence. And I'm having feelings of like, I'm a fraud, I have no plan. And that happens once, that's kind of funny. It happens twice, that's interesting. When I noticed that it started happening every time I was walking into a meeting, I realized, I have a problem here, and I need to figure out what this fear is all about. So I think you really look for patterns in your work. And I think another way you can suss this out and figure out if fear is holding you back is when you find yourself avoiding something. You recognize you have a fear, and you avoid dealing with it. That's a problem. Then it's really elevated to a problem. So thank you for that question. Why is fear a problem? Well, there's 6 reasons, and it's very clear. Fear wastes money, wastes time, wastes talent. It results in less learning and improving, which results in less impact, philanthropic impact that you're able to have, and most importantly, it's no fun. Fear is sucking the life and the joy out of you. And I would suggest that in just about any example that you can think of where fear is holding you back, you can look at this list and realize that probably at least 3, if not all 6 of these are happening. So all of this, this is not effective philanthropy, right? This is not good stewardship. And it's certainly not having, quick and dramatic impact on whatever issue it is that you care about. So let me just give you a couple examples and I'll tell you what I mean. So one example of fear is, I was working with a funder who was refraining from firing somebody, even though this person was creating a toxic environment in their foundation, right? And he was experiencing fear related to, I don't want to disappoint this person, I don't want to hurt them. He feared that it would reflect a failure of his leadership because he was the one that hired him and really advocated for hiring him. He worried that it would be, he feared that there'd be missing deadlines. This person was involved in this big project. What would happen to the project, right? There was all this fear involved in firing this person who was creating a toxic work environment for everybody else. And what happens when there's toxic work environments is a lot of bad things, right? There's a loss of morale among your team, which then results in lost productivity among your staff, because now you have some staff that are kind of shutting down because they're frustrated. Some staff who are, guess what, brushing up on their resumes and looking for other jobs. And you have other staff that are just kind of, towing the line and kind of doing the basics of what they need to do, but not really operating as an A player. And it might cause your best people to leave because people begin to get really frustrated over time and they're questioning your leadership, right? So in that example, you certainly are wasting money because you're paying somebody who's wreaking havoc on your organization. You're wasting time and the talent of all the other staff who are now not giving you their best stuff, right? They're not being their most productive selves and best selves. You certainly have less impact because collectively you're not accomplishing a lot as an organization, and it's definitely no fun for anybody in the organization, including the person who you should fire, because he probably or she probably would be better suited in a different job. Another example that shows why fear is a problem is related to disaggregating data. So, when a foundation or funder seeks to become more diverse, inclusive, and equitable in their foundation and their grant making and how they work, one way to do that, of many ways, is to disaggregate your data by race and ethnicity or neighborhood or whatever's relevant, disability, to really unpack so you can really see what it is you're doing and accomplishing or not accomplishing, what's happening in your community. But a lot of funders are essentially afraid to do that because they are so stuck in their strategies and what they perceive to be working well, they don't want to mess with it. So for example, if your goal is to increase reading by 3rd grade in your town, and you've been funding this, you've invested, I don't know, $5 million to improve reading, and the data show over 3 years, on average, reading is improving, they are reading by 3rd grade, you're celebrating, you're so excited that it worked, and you're afraid to disaggregate the data because you know what you might find? You might find that for certain ethnic groups, they're not doing as well, or they're doing worse. And it's only because some ethnic groups are doing so much better, or kids from some schools are doing so much dramatically better, that it's lifting up the whole average. We have this whole swath of kids that are now doing worse than they were before, right? And you don't want to learn that because now you have to rethink all your effort, your interventions, your partners, your delivery, whatever it is. So here, you're certainly wasting money. Your $5 million is having the opposite effect on some kids. You're wasting just about everybody's time except the kids that are doing better. You're certainly not learning and improving, right? Because you're not willing to look at real data. And you're obviously having less of an impact than you thought you would. And I think that's probably no fun for anybody. So those are just a few ways. And I think if you kind of keep that list in front of you, you recognize that fear isn't just something like, oh yeah, I need to deal with this. Like fear is really legitimately causing problems in our work and causing us to be less effective in how we go about doing things. Okay, so now I want to talk about what to do about this. And what I want you to think about here, I'm going to give you 13 strategies. You can implement one of them, 3 of them, all 13 of them, but think about building your muscle. Think about strengthening yourself. Think about building your immunity to bust through and flick off fear, right? So that it can't, you're like Teflon, like it comes at you and it bounces right off. So this is really all about developing yourself, developing your organization so that overall you're stronger, smarter, faster, like you're the bionic foundation. So that fear has much less impact on you. You probably can't escape it, but it'll have much less impact. And here, I do have these up here. All right. Okay, so these are in no particular order, except the first one is the most important because it has to start first. So the first is to talk openly about fear, right? It's kind of like being an alcoholic, right? The first step is you have to admit that you have a problem before you can do anything about it. So I think it's important to think about how do you talk openly about fear. And this, live webinar is one great place to start. And the discussion guide that you have, you can certainly discuss it with your colleagues and your team, but even if you just talk about it to yourself, I think you can make a lot of improvement. The second is to take prudent risk. And we talked about this in the webinar on innovation, because not all risk is worth taking, right? And you want to think about prudent risk. And prudent risk is assessing the risky idea or initiative or new tool or whatever it might be against 4 criteria to see if it's worth pursuing. And that is cost. So what is the cost going to be if we tried this new risky whatever it is? Literally, how much is it going to outlay of money, or cost in terms of time, or cost in terms of diverting our attention from something else? Then secondly, what's the benefit? What might be the impact on the community, on staff morale, on whatever it is we're trying to accomplish, on our city, on our legacy, on our reputation? What's the possible benefit for us? The third is strategic fit. So to what extent does this new risky endeavor, will it help us maybe dramatically reach our strategic goal, or might it take us off track? In the session we did on increasing speed in philanthropy, I believe, we talked about getting lost in the bandwagon byway. And so if you have a clear strategy of what you're trying to accomplish, you really want everything that you're doing to help you get to that strategy. You don't want to get distracted by things that will take you off course. So if it doesn't fit with your strategy, it probably is not worth pursuing. And then the fourth way to assess prudent risk is difficulty of implementation. So the cost-benefit ratio might be fabulous, it totally fits with your strategy, but it's going to be too unwieldy to implement. Like, we would need to hire a whole new team, it's very complex, we don't even know who to hire or how to get this technology, expertise, whatever it might be. Like, it's just too much for us. So it might not be a good fit. So you look at all of those things together and you assess prudent risk. The third is continuous learning and development, and really thinking about the importance of developing yourself as an individual and as an organization, and really investing in that and taking the time to grow professionally and personally, your capacity, your leadership, your knowledge of what's happening in the community. You really have no idea as an individual if the issues and fears that you're experiencing are just you, like it's just your problem and you're fearful, or if like literally everybody in philanthropy experiences this, or some people do, or whatnot. And you can't really know that unless you get out there and engage and develop yourself. Maybe go to conferences, go to your local regional association of grant makers, join a CEO forum, some kind of peer network. You just started running your corporate giving program, but you have no experience in philanthropy. Well, there's lots of associations of corporate philanthropy organizations that you can join or be part of or read about or watch a webinar online, whatever, to really brush up your skills and understanding and familiarity. Similarly, I think it's important to continuously learn about your community and getting out of your bubble and into your community so that you're kind of keenly aware of what's going on at all times, again, to help you reduce fear as things come up. So a couple examples I really like because they're just different. One is a funder who literally walked his entire town. Now, I don't think it was the size of Los Angeles, but he walked every block, every alley, everything, because he just wanted to know. That was part of his learning about the community. Another funder regularly, every month, takes a new city council person out to lunch with no agenda except tell me about what's going on in the city from your perspective, and I'll tell you what I'm seeing from my perspective running this foundation, and let's learn from each other and get to know each other. A year later, he has a much greater understanding of what's happening and who to go to. So when change happens, he doesn't experience fear. He's like ready to go. The fourth is build upon your strengths. I'm a social worker by training, and one of the big takeaways from my master's in social work program was to always have a strengths-based approach, to always focus on what are people's strengths and how do we build upon them, because really it's only by identifying our successes and our strengths and building upon them that we can grow and improve, right? But what do we usually do instead? Something ends and we conduct what's called a post-mortem, which refers to death, right? And we focus on like picking apart all that went wrong. And talking about the failures, and if we had done it this way, this would have been better, and yada, yada, yada. Not that that isn't important, but what I think funders really need to do instead is to look for patterns of success and replicate them. So let's say you're a family foundation, you've been around for a while, and you successfully engaged the last, next generation who are now, my age or whatever. And that went really well 20 years ago. And now the next generation, like their kids are coming up down the pike and they want to get involved, and you want to, engage them as well. So look at your patterns of success. What went well that first round? What did you do well? We often look for best practices with other foundations, and we need to look to ourselves and our own best practices and replicate them. So maybe what went well was you took the new family board members to conferences, philanthropy conferences to learn. You let them sit in on board meetings a year in advance to listen. You made sure you spent time answering all their questions, took them on site visits, whatever it was, right? That worked. So you can replicate and build upon that success. The fifth way to combat fear is to formulate your strategy and implement your strategy. And you hear me talk about this a lot because it's really important. But if you know where you're headed and how you're going to get from where you are now to where you're headed, then everything becomes much more clear. And your choices and the choices that your team might make, or your board, or your husband, or whomever's involved in your giving, all fall into line. And you're reducing then the fear that people experience when they don't know what's going on. They don't know, you've created your strategic plan, but no one has any idea what happens next. Like, what are your top priorities for implementing it? What are their marching orders? And that creates a lot of confusion and distress and fear among the people involved who are supposed to be helping you implement. The sixth is to build what I call fear-whacking practices. So these are things that you can just begin to incorporate into all aspects of your work and your life that just become kind of a normal part of doing business. I mean, if if a mosquito lands on your arm, you're not going to sit there and watch it like suck the blood out of you, right? No, you're going to whack it off. And that's just a natural response. And so we need to create fear-whacking responses all the time. So this looks like creating a risk list. I've talked about risk before, but if you, let's say you're engaging in some new risky endeavor, you're going to go for it, but you want to create a risk list, which is everyone brainstorms, like, what's the worst thing that can happen if this thing, fails? Put it all up on easel paper and, cross off the ones that really are unrealistic. And then the ones that remain, deal with them. Like, talk about how can we mitigate against this risk or prevent it from happening? What are some steps we can take? Go off and do that. And then the next meeting you have, bring that risk list back, cross off the ones that are no longer risky because they've been dealt with, maybe add a few more. But if that's a practice that you're always engaging in, then it really whacks fear, because even though you're addressing fear, you and your team will know that you're dealing with it, right? It's not just this unknown, it's something that you're actively dealing with. Another one that I like to use a lot myself and with my clients is the 80-20 rule, which is, in this case, if you're 80% there, you move. And don't worry about the remaining 20%. Don't have fear about that remaining 20%, because that remaining 20% is going to take a long time. It's really probably not that important. And if you start moving, because you have clarity on your first 80%, you can have the confidence that you'll figure the rest of it out along the way, and you can make course corrections along the way. The seventh is to create healthy support systems. And really to think about, who are you? Oh, this is number 7, so let me move my list. Create healthy support systems. So think about, like, literally, who are you surrounding yourself with? And I'm talking about you personally and as a foundation, but quite literally, your spouse, or your significant other, your friends, your family, your boss, your board, your colleagues, the other professionals that you work with on a regular basis, whomever, right? Think about these people, because they're influencing you. And to what extent are they contributing to you feeling fearful, or are they contributing to you having confidence and really giving you encouragement and true support, right? Are they the people that are constantly claiming that the sky is falling, they're kind of nitpicking at you, causing you to second guess yourself, criticizing you? Is that their behavior? Because if it is, you need to get rid of them. And I know it's easier said than done, but I mean, you really need to begin to remove people from your life that are contributing to your fear. Obviously, you can't remove your children. You can certainly change your relationship, but you can, if you have a friend from high school that you've been hanging out with who just always makes you feel bad, stop hanging out with them. And if you work in an environment where people are always criticizing you, learn what you can about how to make improvements, but also you might want to think about, is this the kind of place that I want to work, and can I thrive here? And if it's not, you might want to change. Is this a board member that's contributing to my success, or are they sucking the energy out of me? Maybe they need to leave the organization. And instead, surround yourself with the people and the structures that can really support you. I'm not saying they should be yes people and always tell you that you're brilliant and have great ideas. They should push your thinking, but in constructive, helpful ways. But think about the friends that can do that for you. Maybe you need new friends. Maybe you need new support systems around you, a CEO forum, other peer networks, people you can turn to when you are feeling fearful that can help you get through the situation. The seventh is to continuously shed in order to grow. So Marshall Goldsmith, who's a well-known, world-renowned executive coach, wrote a book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And the point is, whatever you did to get to where you are now, like it worked because it got you to where you are now, but it probably aren't the same strategies, approaches, relationships that you need to get to where you're headed. And that's true for individuals, and that's true for organizations as well. I was in Maine, in Kennebunkport, Maine, a few months ago, where I ate a lot of lobster, which was delicious. And I've learned that lobsters, in order for them to grow, they have to literally shed their entire shell all at once, right? They have this like hard exoskeleton or some such thing. They have to shed their shell, during which time they're like these squishy blobs, and they're really vulnerable to attack. And some period of time passes, and then their new shell grows back, right? And this happens apparently 25 times before they're age 7. So this is happening a lot. But really think about, how do we as funders need to shed our shells and the things that are holding us back, the fears that are holding us back, so that we can grow and improve and increase our impact. I was at a conference recently, and I heard from the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, which is in the process of engaging in this pretty massive cultural change effort and change in strategy and everything, right? A real big transformation of the whole organization. And they have about, 35, 40 staff. And they said, we've had about 60% staff turnover during this time. And it really makes sense, right? Because what got them to where they were is not going to get them to where they're going. And that includes the people, in many cases, that are involved. They're just not the right fit for this new organization. They're the right fit for a different kind of organization. And so you have to shed sometimes the people that are working with you in order to create the change you want. The 9th is to not generalize from a specific. So this is things like if your first policy grant, you finally mustered up the courage to fund policy advocacy, and you don't achieve a policy win, your legislation doesn't pass in the House or whatever it is. If you don't generalize from a specific and say, well, therefore we can't do this anymore, we must not be cut out to be policy funders, right? Because you had one experience and you're generalizing the rest of your potential experiences from that one experience. I once, my very first time I ever gave a keynote speech at a philanthropy conference, this was many, many years ago, I was asked to speak at a conference. The funder hired me to speak to their grantees. The funder was there in the room. I gave the speech. I thought it went well. They applauded. I walked off the stage, kind of full of energy and excitement. I sit down at the table where the foundation CEO and his staff were seated. I could tell immediately they didn't like the speech. Their energy was, strange, and they were sort of glaring at me. And so I had received, fabulous reviews from the audience, but not fabulous reviews from the CEO who had hired me, which is the most important. And it scared me, honestly. I felt fear. I felt I'm not cut out for speaking. I don't know what I'm doing, apparently. I don't have what it takes to be able to do this. And I shied away from public speaking for a long time after that. So I think this is an example of generalizing from a specific. I had one experience. Rather than learn for it and keep trying to improve, I just kind of stopped. The 9th is stop watching the news. And that might seem silly. And of course, I don't mean to never look at the newspaper again or watch the news. But I mean, truly, there are times when we just need to stop watching the news and stop checking Facebook and stop checking Twitter and just give ourselves a break, because a lot of this can add to our fears and cause us a lot of stress. My husband and I took a vacation last year, and I deleted all the apps on my phone that were like the CNN and the Wall Street Journal apps. And it was a relief to not have to have all that buzzing and coming at me while I was on vacation. We need to give ourselves breaks. Okay, the next one is, number 11, is to familiarize yourself with your environment. So this would be, a good example is public speaking. People are often fearful of getting on stage and giving a speech. What if you forget your notes or whatever, things don't go right? And one way to address that is to literally familiarize yourself with your environment. Show up at the venue the day before or that morning, walk on stage, look at what it's going to look like, to look at the audience, kind of get a sense of where you are and where the table is going to be and whatnot, so that you feel more comfortable with that. But I think, it's the same holds true in any aspect of our work. If you just opened a new giant donor-advised fund and you really don't know what you're doing, there are lots of resources that you can turn to help familiarize yourself with your new philanthropic environment. You can take courses online, you can talk to colleagues, other donors that have opened donor-advised funds, go to forums, go to some events, familiarize yourself with grant making and the language and whatever it is. And that example could be applied to anything that you're doing, to kind of familiarize yourself with something before you launch into it. Number 12 is to get professional help. So this is things like getting a coach, an advisor, a mentor. Of course, I've jokingly mentioned a therapist, but I'm not discounting that. That's important at times. There are people who can help you address these fears. I mean, certainly if it's a phobia, then you need truly help, therapeutic help. But I was talking to a donor of a family foundation, and she is in the process of deciding, do I shift from a donor-advised fund to or switch my family foundation into a donor-advised fund? I want to engage more people in the community, in my work. How do I go about doing that? I want to become more strategic. How do I do that? I like to engage my kids when they graduate. How do I do that? And she had lots of self-doubt and fear about how to approach her work, and wanted to hire me as an advisor to help her navigate all of this, help her kind of make these choices and navigate some of these decisions and be a sounding board to her. Now, you don't have to hire me. There are, trust me, hundreds, if not thousands, of advisors out there that could help you, and coaches and whatnot. But I think it is important to get help. I mean, I have myself, for my own consulting business, I have an advisor that I work with and trust. And, it's helpful to have. I also have a whole group of consultants online that I talk to regularly and interact with. And just knowing that these people are there to help me, even if I don't talk to them, helps to reduce my fear in what I'm doing. So I think, that's a really important strategy to consider. Let me just look at questions and see if there are any questions before we move on. So there's two. I'm afraid I might only have time for one. So the question is, how are we unintentionally creating fear in others? So that's a really good question. I've talked a lot about how we experience fear, but how do we create fear for other people? And I think we do that. There's two kind of categories of people we do that for. One is the people we work with, either our staff or colleagues or board or whatnot, and then our grantees. I think with our staff and our colleagues, it comes in the form of things like micromanaging. It comes in the form of things like waffling on decisions and not making decisions, being overly critical. These kinds of things can create a lot of fear for other people, not having clarity about direction and strategy. When the people who are working for you or with you aren't sure what they're supposed to be doing and are constantly hearing that they're not doing it well, or are being told, well, you tried it, but now I have to fix it. You need to do it this way or that way. It creates a lot of fear for the people that we work with. I think with our grantees, the one thing that evokes fear the most for grantees is declaring that you're going to start strategic planning, because they immediately think, oh my God, what's going to happen? Am I going to lose funding? Are we going to fit in the new funding areas? And I think, adequate or ample or an abundance of communication and timeliness and responsiveness can really help address that for grantees. I just want to share the last way to combat and bash fear, and that's to up your game as a funder. As a funder, we have very little anybody really holding us accountable, right? There's very little legislation in the U.S. at least that we need to deal with. The people that could most likely criticize us are afraid to, our grantees. And so I think it's up to us to really up our game and to make sure that we push ourselves to dramatically grow, to make sure we have the right people in the right seats, we formulate strategy, we implement it well, we invest in ourselves, we try new tools, we seek to be best in class, we bring in the top experts to advise us in our work, and we really try to live our values as organizations, understand what our values are and operationalize and live them. So those are the 13 ways that I think if you engage in all of those practices, you will do an awesome job at building your strength, building your immunity, and whacking away a lot of the fears that you have. So just in summary, we talked about the 11 ways that fear manifests itself in philanthropy, none of which are really acceptable, and all of which you now have 13 strategies that you can use to combat. And so with that, I hope that you have enjoyed this entire 6-part series. I've loved doing this. It's been fabulous. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your year and a fearless rest of your year. Thank you very much.